Okay, as promised last week, in learning how to light, we've finally moved on to advanced ways of triggering your flash. I'm talking here about advanced optical systems like Nikon's CLS system and the myriad of ways you can now use radio triggers to trigger your flashes. Now we come to the expensive stuff, the really clever stuff. Radio triggers. For what it's worth, this is the sort of thing that I use day in, day out when I'm working. A radio trigger will consist of two pieces. A transmitter, which will attach to your camera, and a receiver, which will attach to your flash unit. Essentially, they work very simply. You will attach this to your camera. When you press the shutter, this sends a radio signal which goes to the receiver. The receiver is then attached to your flash and tells the flash to fire. Simple as that, really. You might also find ones like this fabulous Photo Air, whereby this is the transmitter and the receivers are built into the flashes themselves. So I don't need even to attach a separate receiver. They just work as standalone units. Generic radio triggers like this Calumet set, of which I own about 3 or 4 sets, are the same across any flash brand. They are fairly simplistic. They work basically as fire, don't fire. Very simple triggers. Like I say, this will attach to the camera, then this via a sync cable will go into the flash unit. It means it can be operated over great distance because, of course, radio allows you to be wireless and it works over a much greater distance than perhaps a line of sight would do with a simple optical slave. But simple ones like this won't allow you any power control or anything like TTL because they are just simple triggers. They just say fire, don't fire to the flash. More advanced ones, like this fabulous Photo Air, will allow me to go in and basically adjust power outputs for each head. It'll allow me to turn heads on and off. It'll allow me to turn modelling lights on and off at a distance, and it will allow me to even use modes like TTL in my more advanced units like this one. Now, needless to say, this is a fabulous plus. This is so useful on a daily working basis, and also it allows you to shoot things you couldn't otherwise. The ability to place flashes in really odd locations can be very handy. It means you can mount flashes, say, high up in the rafters of something, and not worry about, first of all, triggering them, and secondly, adjusting the power output, because they're way up in the rafters attached to a spar of some sort, and you simply sit down here and go, okay, put another stop in that, take 2/3 of a stop out of that, away you go. It means you can use them outdoors without worrying about line of sight, without worrying about the bright sunlight overpowering the sensor that's using an optical slave. They're extremely handy, okay? So you can see why I love using them. I have this attached to my camera the whole time I'm using my Pro Photos. It really is an absolute godsend. Pretty much all of these triggers as well can also be set to different channels. Now, this can be very handy if you are working in an environment with other photographers and you're all using the same system, because of course everything on, say, Pro Photo Channel 1 will be triggered by Pro Photo Channel 1. So if I keep all my lights to Channel 1 and the photographer next to me keeps all hers to Channel 2, we won't set each other's flashes off. If, however, I'm working on my own but I've got lots of lights, the same system can also allow me to have, say, more than one setup in one place. I could have an entire lighting setup on Channel 1 where I've got maybe 2 or 3 heads and they're creating a soft studio look, and then I very rapidly switch to Channel 2, swing round, and my other heads are set for a hard dramatic look, meaning I can get you 2 different looks in a very short space of time. Very useful trick. The drawbacks are that, of course, these things are a bit more expensive, but perhaps not as expensive as you think. This one, this fabulous thing I keep raving about, this Photo Air trigger, is expensive. It's a few £100s. These generic Calumet ones, which, as I say, are just simple triggers, they just let you fire the flash or don't fire the flash, are much cheaper. I believe they're about £50 for a pair. Obviously you need them in pairs, transmitter and receiver. So much so that I have a few of these stuffed in various bits of my kit as an emergency backup. Being radio, all radio triggers are in some way vulnerable to interference from other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. That can mean everything from smartphones to powerful computers to radars, as I've found in the past. I've actually had problems working with friends of mine in the Royal Navy where radio triggers have been mucked about by very powerful radar transmitters. And you can't escape that, but what I will say is, again, you get what you pay for. These cheaper ones tend to be much more susceptible to interference, and you know what's coming. Something like this, I've had very, very few problems with. Primarily I understand because of different wavelengths they use, but let's not really worry about that right now. That's a bit beyond what we need to know. Now you can probably guess I'm quite a fan of radio triggers full stop. I switched to using them probably about 15 years ago, and I've used various different types over the years before finally settling on these little beauties. The ability to simply have just one trigger on the camera and everything else controlled by one of these. It's one of those things that you don't appreciate how useful it is until you've used it, and then you think, my God, how did I manage without it? Don't be put off by price though. Yes, this one is expensive, but these are remarkably cheap for what they are and what they'll let you do. And as I say, once you've started using them, you do start to think to yourself, oh, how on earth have I managed without the simple convenience of radio triggers? The final type of triggering I want to talk about is specific to different camera manufacturers, so it's quite hard to give it a name. Nikon call theirs CLS, Creative Lighting System. Can't remember what Canon call theirs, and I believe other manufacturers have a system as well, but it's specific to each manufacturer. Now, what it does is it's essentially like the radio triggering system I've just spoken about, except it uses light rather than radio signals, although there are now versions coming in that are built into flash guns that also use radio triggers. You have a master flash, which acts as your controller and your trigger, and then any number of slave flashes, which are set to the right channel and the right group, and in tiny fractions of a second before this fires its main flash, it sends out a pulse of light, which talks to the other flashes. They fire pulses as well to read the amount of light, trigger them back, and the whole thing communicates in an incredibly short period of time, which allows you to control the power output of other flashes from here, allows you to use things like TTL metering if you want to, and allows you to set different channels, etc. So you can have sort of 2 flashes that are doing this and then 2 flashes that are doing that at a flick of a button. So lots and lots of the advantage you would get with a radio triggering system, but built into your flash guns and all controllable from the back. Very, very handy. What's the catch? Because there's always a catch, isn't there? I mean, you've seen enough of my videos now to know this is the point where I tell you there's a catch. Well, there's a few. For starters, of course, all of these systems are specific to each camera manufacturer. So I couldn't say take this Nikon flash gun and a Canon flash gun or an Olympus flash gun and expect them to talk to each other. I need to buy a whole range of Nikon flash guns that are all on this system, a CLS system. So straight away there's a cost issue. The biggest drawback though, in my opinion, because I do occasionally use this, but not very often, is being an optical system, it requires line of sight, and of course it's also affected by how much light there is around. So used outside on bright sunny days, it doesn't reach very far. And of course line of sight also means that if I were to take one of these remote flashes and hide it around behind something, I'd struggle to trigger it. The other little technical catch is that since it works by sending out a little pre-flash, that can often mess with you using things like a standard optical slave, because of course that first tiny little flash that this sends out to use as a trigger for the other flashes and to read what they're doing before it sends the real flash will set off other lights that are, say, on a standard optical slave, so things will be out of sync. So you might be using this and mixing it with, your standard pro photo stuff on manual power, and these won't be firing, or they'll be firing ahead of time and not registering on the camera. So you have to use it as part of a self-contained system. As I say, I've used it from time to time. It does have its uses, but as a working professional, I don't find it as useful as proper radio systems. You are starting to see increasingly radios built into these flash guns, but again, you need to have a whole matching set. And you can also get quite expensive radio triggers, which will allow you to sort of take the optical signals, turn them into radio signals, and then get around the line of sight problems. And whilst this is fantastic in many ways, it's very, very expensive, because now you not only need a matching set of flash guns that all work on the same system, but each flash gun now needs its own expensive radio trigger. So unless you're really, really tied into using this system, I'd actually suggest that you go and buy yourself an inexpensive set of radio triggers and learn how to use them better. So that's how to trigger your flash. I'm sorry for going into so much detail, but if you'll excuse me, that's because it can be such a bewildering subject when you're just starting out. It certainly confused the life out of me when I was just starting, and in those days things were simpler. Things like radio triggers barely existed when I started out. You've got to get it right, obviously. If you want to take your flash off camera in any way, you need to trigger it in some form, so you need to understand some of this, even if you don't go out and spend a fortune on things like radio triggers. That about wraps flash up for now. That's all we need to cover. We'll be addressing it in a bit more depth later on when we talk about different modifiers. But now, let's move on to continuous light. Right, that's flash all covered in as much detail as I think I really want to go into. Next week I'm going to talk about continuous artificial lighting, so things like LEDs, tungstens, fluorescent tubes, etc. Don't forget, this is part of a free lighting course that I'm releasing week by week on YouTube. Hit subscribe so you get notifications, like if you like what you're seeing, and obviously stick any questions in the comments below. See you soon.